Hi everyone, hold on to your horses and tighten up your britches. Today I have yet another set of shocking stories that are sure to make your head spin. You might even learn the truth about something that makes it impossible for you to sleep tonight. So get yourself comfortable, grab your favorite drink, and cozy up with that subscribe button. Thanks. Now let's get into the stories. Many years ago, I had a very strange and dark friend named Mandy. She was the kind of girl who scared people because of the way she dressed, mainly in black. She was bullied a lot for it, but she was nice if you took the time to get to know her. Well, at least, for a while. Here's the story of what happened to us. I remember quite vividly that in 11th grade, she got quite heavy into ghosts and stuff like that. Mandy had a brother, Tony, was friends with them both, and went to their house a lot. Interestingly, their bedrooms were in the basement of their mom's house. We would all hang out down there and play with their Ouija board and do light as a feather, stiff as a board, stuff like that. It was cool because their mom couldn't hear us if we stayed up too late. Sometimes Tony would try to scare us if he had gotten bored and left us to ourselves. One time he turned off the power to the basement while we were down there. It scared the crap out of me until he came running down the stairs laughing his head off. One day, Tony told his mom what we were doing at our hangouts, and she told my parents as if it was all my doing. My parents freaked out that she was influencing me. Meanwhile, Mandy's mom thought it was me influencing her. I wasn't allowed to stay at their house after that. I convinced my parents to let me hang out with them at our house after they got over being mad. But we had this strict, they have to go home now, curfew. And we had to keep the door open all the time. The next school year, my parents let me hang out at Mandy's house again. Just no sleepovers. But after a few months of letting me go over, they eased up and then they let me stay all night again. So Mandy, Tony, and I planned a sleepover at their house one weekend. Mandy made big plans for the reunion, as she called it, but she wouldn't say what they were. I remember being a little bit nervous about it. Mandy's entire life seemed to revolve around ghosts at this point. It's all she ever wanted to talk about. So when the weekend arrived, Tony pulled me aside at school and told me I shouldn't stay at their house. Not that night, because his sister was acting weird, and he had a bad feeling about it. When I got to their house that evening, some of Tony's friends that I didn't know showed up, and they all stood outside laughing and talking before he came inside and said goodbye to us and left. Mandy's mom went out to some ladies' night thing with her friends, so Mandy and I had the house to ourselves. The sleepover went like any other. We did the same old stuff. I was beginning to wonder if Mandy really had any big plans like she kept saying. But then around 11 o'clock, Mandy asked me if I was ready. She grabbed her backpack and we went out to her car. We drove for 20 minutes before I figured out where we were going. We turned down this road and I knew immediately that we were heading for the cemetery. I told her to turn back and that I didn't want to go, but she just started making fun of me and locked the doors. I texted Tony. I asked him if he really knew what she had planned because I was starting to freak out. But all he texted back was, "Don't go." He wouldn't even answer when I tried to call him. When Mandy drove into the cemetery, I had already asked her to take me home 1,000 times. She stopped answering and talking altogether, was just driving in silence. She stopped the car when we reached the far corner. I didn't want to get out, but Mandy walked so far that I started to lose sight of her, and at this point, I didn't want to be alone in a graveyard. When I did catch up to her, she was opening her bag, and then she put candles down in a circle and lit them. This was going too far. She said we were going to have a seance, and I tried to laugh it off, but something about her face told me she was deadly serious. She reached up and pulled me down into a sitting position with this crazy strength that I didn't know she had. Her face was pale as it was, but I remembered that she looked so white under the moon. Mandy closed her eyes and started whispering. I told her to cut it out, but she said to shut up and close my eyes or she would leave me there to walk home. I remember starting to close my eyes when the candles blew out. They shut out like they were on a switch. No smoke or anything, just out. And when Mandy opened her eyes, I could have sworn she was somebody else. I stood up, backing away from her. "It's too late," she said, but it wasn't her voice. All of a sudden, the candles lit back up and Mandy laughed like a crazy person. I honestly thought Tony and his friends were in on this, like they were trick candles, something, because how on earth was she pulling this off? But I was scared to death. What if it was real? I started running towards Mandy's car, but when I got there, it looked like she was already inside. But then I turned around, and Mandy was behind me, and now there was no one in the car. Luckily, some headlights were now coming down one of the cemetery paths, and I bolted towards them. They stopped for me. It was Tony and his friends. I jumped in the back seat, and I made them take me home instantly. Mandy stayed back with the car. I have to tell you, I haven't talked to Mandy since. We're no longer friends. I don't know what happened to her. I grew up in a family that was always struggling to make ends meet. We lived in a poor part of Michigan, and just about everybody around us was in the same boat. We lived in a mobile home that was old and cramped and sort of dilapidated. It was our grandpa's land that surrounded the home. He had somehow managed to hang on to that parcel even though he had lost everything else. My friends and I were always out in the woods, exploring and building forts and all kinds of stuff. Living near a small town had its perks and its drawbacks. On one hand, there was a strong sense of community that's hard to find in a big city. Everybody around there knew each other, and everybody was willing to lend a hand whenever needed. On the other hand, there was a sense of isolation that came with living in a rural area. Entertainment options were limited, and the town's nightlife basically consisted of drinking and partying. But we always felt like it was a safe place to live. Back then, the concept of locking your doors or setting an alarm seemed completely unnecessary. We trusted our neighbors and we felt secure in our surroundings. Our home only had one bedroom, but my parents always prioritized me, and they sacrificed their own comfort. They slept on the fold-out couch in the living room, which was connected to my room. One night, when everybody was sound asleep, my dad was jolted awake by a feeling that somebody was lurking in the room. He said he saw a big guy sitting in the recliner. He flicked on the lamp, and he came face to face with our neighbor John from down the road. Now, John had a reputation of doing this kind of thing and was always getting himself in trouble. I heard my dad yelling and got out of bed and was watching from the doorway. When my dad confronted him and asked what he was doing there, John blurted out that he was being chased by a demon and that our house was the only place that was safe. Now, my dad, who was a pretty intimidating big guy, said that if John didn't leave, he would find out how actually unsafe our house could be. But John insisted that he couldn't leave and that the demon had been stalking him all night. And then my mom chimed in, and even though she was just a small woman, I think her intense anger is what finally got John to leave. She got right in his face, and he finally went outside. My dad jumped up and immediately locked the door, making sure that John wouldn't be able to come back inside. Then me and my parents watched out the window, and we saw John head toward our old beat-up Bronco that was always parked out there, unlocked. John looked panicked and crazy, and it seemed like he was in the grip of some kind of paranoid delusion. We watched him get into the driver's seat and fumble around like he was trying to find the keys, but luckily my dad at least didn't leave the keys in the car. John's behavior had gotten increasingly erratic over the years. His family didn't know how to help him. So he was just sitting there in the Bronco, all agitated, when suddenly something seemed to catch his eye from the woods in front of him. He held his hands up in front of his face and started yelling that the demon was back. He screamed for it to stay away from him. We watched from the window and were shocked when we looked in that direction and saw 2 points of glowing yellow, like eyes peering out of the trees. Whatever it was, it started moving closer and closer to the Bronco. John kept screaming and yelling. There was actually something there. We were all petrified, completely in disbelief. We saw this creature come out of the woods that was approaching, 7 feet tall, and looked like some kind of a rotting corpse. It had a skull-like head, and it looked like it had tattered flesh hanging off of it. The body was so thin and stretched out, and it seemed like it had the legs of a deer. But it was definitely not a deer. This thing was walking upright, and its eyes just looked so evil. John started leaning on the horn, trying to scare it off, but it didn't have any effect. At that point, I was wishing he did have the keys to the car, so he could just drive away. We kept watching in horror while the creature got closer, and then my dad just came to his senses. He went and grabbed his pistol from the top shelf of the kitchen cupboard. He then ran to the door and started firing. I swear a bullet went right through that thing, and it stared right at my dad. But then it turned and immediately disappeared right back into the woods. My dad then brought John back into the house and said he was sorry for making him go back out there. But who would have ever thought that the demon was actually real? After that, we felt extremely uncomfortable for a long time. But my dad kept saying that he had a strong feeling that the creature had specifically been after John. I don't know if that's true, but we never saw any sight of it again. Well, that was sure some kind of a wake-up call for John's family, though. They realized the extent of his problems, and they knew that he needed help. They knew that him wandering around all hours of the night wasn't doing anybody any good. So he ended up getting the help he needed, which seemed to help him at least a little. I'd like to know how they reacted, though, if he told them the demon story and the truth of what's in the woods. What do you think of small-town cryptids? We don't have to name the big ones, do we? The ones that everybody talks about. They're so popular that it probably doesn't matter if they're real or not. The big cryptids have already been immortalized. They're already talked about so frequently that they'll always be real to some people. Now me, I'm more interested in the creatures that you don't know. I have no choice but to be fascinated, really. After all, I've seen one, and it doesn't get any more real than that. I've lived in Ohio all my life. I'm unfortunately the type of person who complains about their surroundings all the time but never does anything to change them. I'm not a fan of Ohio, but I'm boring too, so I guess it's okay if I stay here. Besides, this is the only place I can get answers. I want to know what I saw here. I want to know why it came for me and no one else. In that short gray period between spring and summer, when the air is tolerable but the rains have stopped, people in my town have this particular hobby. We like to light bonfires and get drunk. Some of us, I suppose, continue that hobby all through the summer. I prefer it when the night air is still a little bit cold. It makes the fire feel more inviting to me. I wish I had accepted that invitation and stayed close to the party on the night I'm about to tell you about. We lit the bonfire on the edge of our local woods. Don't worry, we were far enough from the trees to keep the embers from reaching the forest. We had everything we needed to extinguish the fire on hand, too, if it came to that. But we also had booze, plenty of it. Personally, I've never been the type to drink until I black out, but I can't say the same for everybody else. For the sake of transparency, though, I will admit that I was a little under the influence. My face was warm, and my usual insecurities were dulled. And that's when I saw it. A guy at the party had wandered off a little, on his own. He was facing the forest. He wasn't moving. So I made my way next to him and looked in the same direction. "Do you see it?" I remember him asking me. It wasn't until he pointed them out, though, that I did, in fact, see them. The blinking little lights, 2 of them, right next to each other. Eyeballs. They were about 4 feet off the ground, and they were big. Had to have been a deer, I said. The fire wasn't bright enough to illuminate anything except the eyeballs, and it sure was curious. It stared back at us the entire time, blinking absent-mindedly every few moments. Now, we had been warned not to go into that forest as children. As adults, we had learned that that was to keep us from getting lost. Whatever we were looking at, though, it couldn't have been one of the monsters from our childhood stories. And then the thing turned away, and the guy next to me joked about going in to investigate. Someone else overheard, and before I knew it, we were all going to check out the perimeter of the woods. We had nothing better to do, I guess. It was fun for a few moments, making each other nervous by pretending it could be a bear watching us from the tree line. A bear, or something worse. It gave us an excuse to laugh. And when we stepped through the threshold and into the forest, however, I stopped laughing. We splintered off into groups of 2 and 1. I was alone, and maybe that's why it came for me. I wish it had gone for the man who saw it first. I didn't even want to be in those woods. I just wanted to be involved. I wanted to be a part of the story. I guess I got what I wanted. Something next to me croaked, deeper, louder than a frog. I turned and saw something shifting. Scales. They were gray in the dim light, and it was like I had seen the back of an iguana sliding behind a fallen tree. It wasn't a bear, I knew that much. It wasn't a deer. It was something else. And then I watched as the thing stood up from behind the log. 4 feet. I was right about that, but nothing else. It was somewhere between a man and a toad and a lizard. My mind couldn't piece it together. I couldn't comprehend why its mouth was so wide and why its eyes were so big. The stomach was bulbous and its back was hunched. Its fingers were long, but they ended in stubs. And then the thing sprinted toward me. I'm lucky it was small. That's the only thing that gave me a chance. I screamed and I ran, and by the time it slammed into my back and knocked me to the ground, others had heard. Others saw it fleeing back into the woods as they surrounded me and helped me back up. Our story was dismissed after the police and paramedics arrived. My injuries were minor, so the story wasn't taken seriously. And besides, we were drunk, they said. Now, I don't know what kind of alcohol could have given us all the same shared hallucination. I don't know why I would have imagined a creature like that attacking me just to run away. But that's our small-town cryptid. That's the monster we have. And that's why I'm so preoccupied, trying to learn about the small creatures with the small stories that no one ever believes. Because I myself am one of those stories. Nobody talks about it. The thing I saw isn't the subject of any social media debates or podcast discussions or YouTube channels for that matter. We are unknown and unheard. But that doesn't mean my story isn't true. What do you think the creature was? And what would it have done if I wasn't rescued? I live in a little town called Blue River in Indiana. It's not even hardly a town since it doesn't have a mayor or anything like that. It's by the Blue River, and I work for a company that rents canoes and kayaks. We do pretty good business in the summer, but not much the rest of the year. Once fall comes, we close except for the weekends, so I have a lot of time on my hands. I like to take my 2 dogs hiking along the river. It's pretty dense woods on both sides of the river, and in places it can be shallow, especially in the fall when there isn't a lot of rain. So sometimes instead of hiking through the woods, we wade along the river. The dogs like that, especially the lab mix since she's really a water dog. They like to sniff everything and they're pretty quiet when we're out there, just taking it all in. But one day, we were walking in the river and both dogs started going nuts, barking and pulling me toward the bank of the river. Like I said, normally they don't do that, even if there's a squirrel or something. I was curious, of course, so I let them go to shore just to see what they were all worked up about. It was sandy and rocky there, almost like just a little beach before the trees started up. I didn't see anything, and I really couldn't figure out what all the barking was about, until I saw tracks in the sand. I had to look really closely to be sure what I was seeing. They were like human footprints, but way bigger. Like if it was a human, it would have been 10 feet tall. At first I thought it was a prank, like maybe somebody had plastic feet or something and pushed them into the sand to make the tracks. But why would they do that way out here when probably nobody would see them? Plus, in the sand like that, the tracks wouldn't last very long. It shifts and the water rises. They'd be gone. So a lot of trouble for nothing. And then there was the dogs going nuts. I didn't know why they were just because of tracks, unless the thing had just left. Maybe it was nearby. The dogs sniffed the tracks, sniffed the air, and then calmed down. I figured the thing had left. Next time we went out, it had been a couple of days, but the dogs started to freak out in the same place. They pulled me to the bank, just like before, and I still didn't see anything at first. I looked closer and nearer to the woods. I saw the tracks again, but then I noticed something else, a pile of animal bones. They were actually piled up, like in a way that no animal would leave them, like in the way that something with hands would place them. And the bones were pretty clean, but a few strands of flesh hung off of them. It sure looked like the meat had been eaten. I couldn't tell if they were raccoon bones or what, but probably something around that size. And then there were also branches and leaves piled up. I'm telling you, it looked like something had made a bed, and a big one. The area also smelled like dirty socks and weirdly human. I would have thought that maybe it was a homeless person living there, but at the time, it smelled like wet dog, too. And urine. The dogs had calmed down again, so either I scared the thing away or it was already leaving. I didn't touch anything, and I just left. It came out the next day, and I really wanted to see it. I remembered where that place was, and I came without the dogs because I thought that maybe they were spooking it. I stood a ways away, and I watched. I didn't see anything, though, even though I stayed for a long time. I was going to give up and go home when I heard a strange noise, like a person yelling, but not saying any words. This went on for a while, and I started to think that maybe the thing saw me and was trying to tell me to go away. I decided maybe I was being rude standing near its home, if that's what this area was, and so I left. After that, I kind of thought I should stay away. I mean, from what I could tell, the thing wasn't hurting anything, or anyone. It had its home there, and it stayed away from people. So I thought I'd just let it be. I kept taking my dogs out, but we just stayed on the other side of the river. As long as I stayed that far away, the dogs didn't try to get me to go closer. Sometimes I would still hear the yelling noise, maybe when another animal got close to its home. We don't have any bears around, I don't think, but maybe coyotes would sometimes bother it. Who knows? After a month, as the weather started to get colder, I thought maybe it moved on because I hadn't heard it anymore. One day, though, I was passing by its place on the other side of the river when I heard that yell, and this time I thought it was calling out to me. I stopped, and I looked, and something came out of the woods. It looked big and hairy, like a hairy man, or maybe a man in a bear suit. The face didn't have any hair, and it kind of looked like a gorilla. Now it was a ways away across the river, but I could definitely tell it wasn't human or a bear. It definitely wasn't a gorilla either because it stood completely upright. Plus, a gorilla would never be here. It waved a big paw-like hand at me. I really think it was thanking me for leaving it alone. At least that's what I like to think. So I've left it alone, and I haven't told this to anybody except you.